Chapter 831. Lily dragged her feet and found a low railing. She sat down and leaned her head against the railing behind her. She was a little tired. She had no strength. Lily squinted at the people coming and going. She was so tired that she almost fell asleep. After sitting under the bridge for a long time, Lily stood up when there were fewer people around. Taking advantage of the fact that no one was paying attention, she struggled to lift her legs and tried to climb up. But the strength in her body was even smaller and more meager than she had imagined. She raised her legs several times but failed. Finally, she managed to climb up. Lily looked at the river below. Before she jumped down, she suddenly felt her collar being tightened. Lily's heart skipped a beat. She turned her head and saw a pair of dangerous eyes. Those peach blossom eyes that were originally shimmering with evil were now like two black gun muzzles, staring at her dangerously coldly. Lily was shocked. She wanted to struggle, but before she could exert much strength, Ming grabbed her by the collar and pulled her down. "What are you doing? Are you crazy?" Lily's voice was not as strong as when she was in the hospital. Her voice was very weak. Lily gasped and tried to slap his hand away. Ming loosened her collar. Lily couldn't support herself anymore and fell to the ground. She had no strength. Lily looked at him, and her eyelids were fighting. Ming squatted down and grabbed her chin with his big hand. His eyes were malicious, and his face was gloomy. He squinted and gritted his teeth. "Do you want to die?" Lily's chin was hurting. She stared at him with hatred and didn't speak. The look in his eyes was as if he had seen his most hated enemy. Ming's heart twitched, and he involuntarily tightened his hand. His lips curled up, and he said with a vengeful pleasure, "Do you think it's so easy? I haven't played enough. Do you think you have the right to die?" His voice was as light as a feather, but every word he said was like a poison that suddenly penetrated into the bone. Lily looked at him, and her eyes quickly turned red. She raised her hand and waved it toward his clean and smooth face. She wanted to give him a slap, but she had no strength in her hand. Her palm crossed his face. It was not a slap, but a touch. Ming saw through her intentions and sneered. He grabbed her arm and stood up. Lily felt uncomfortable, and her throat felt nauseous. "I thought you would run away to find your old lover. I didn't expect that you don't even have someone who wants you." Ming looked at her with sarcasm in his eyes. "It seems that there aren't many people who are blind." Lily was so angry that her eyes turned red. "You've been following me? It turns out that you've disappointed me too much." Ming's words were tantamount to a tacit admission. Lily closed her eyes and didn't want to move. Seeing this, Ming's eyes darkened, and he picked her up. So light. This woman was so thin that she could almost fly. His big hand pinched her waist, and Ming's heart ached even more. There was not a bit of flesh on his body, and his hands were so skinny that they were only skin and bones. What kind of life had she been living all these years? Lily leaned on his arm. She was so dizzy that she didn't have much consciousness. She closed her eyes and raised her head, motionless. Chapter 832. After that, he gritted his teeth and strode back in the direction of the hospital. Lily didn't hear what he was saying and fell asleep. When she woke up, it was already midnight. Heartbeat monitor and nutrient solution were standard. When she opened her eyes, it was dark around her. She saw a flash of light from the corner of her eyes. She looked sideways and found it was a laptop. It was the latest model of a famous luxury brand, a very expensive model. There was no doubt that it was Ming's. But, why is he still here in the middle of the night? Before she could recover, the light in the ward was suddenly turned on. The sudden light made Lily subconsciously tilt her head and close her eyes. It took a long time for her to adapt to the light, and she heard the sound of a paper bag. Turning her head, she saw a young man, who looked ordinary, but very clean and delicate. The height looked about 175 to 178, wearing a professional suit, and he took something out of a paper bag. The aroma of food wafted out, and Yu Lily smelled it and felt even more uncomfortable. Su Qing felt Yu Lily's gaze, so he opened the lunch box and said, "Since you are awake, get up and eat something. Master O just went out. He has been guarding you for several days and hasn't had a good rest. You can let him go back and have a good sleep later, miss you." Yu Lily heard that and was slightly stunned. But before she could react, she heard a cold voice coming from outside. "It seems that Special Assistant Su is too idle." The sound of leather shoes came in, and Oh Ming stood at the door with a pair of beautiful eyes, looking inside. It just happens that the planning department is short of people, and Special Assistant Su can go there to exercise. Su Cheng was a little embarrassed. After putting down the things, he bowed his head and said, "Sorry, Master O, I am too meddlesome." Oh Ming's cold eyes fell on Su Cheng with a threatening sharpness, and he said quietly, "You are meddlesome, but if someone misunderstands, it will be embarrassing, right?" When Su Cheng heard this, he felt a little inexplicable, but when he saw Oh Ming's threatening eyes, he immediately gave in. Yes. Yes. Go back first, and leave it." Oh Ming walked in slowly and glanced at it. "You bought such light food, how can I eat?" "Su Cheng, boss, it was you who asked me to buy light food. Are you trying to blame me?" Su Cheng was flustered, but when he saw Oh Ming's expression, he didn't dare to speak carelessly. He said, "I caught a cold recently, and I'm used to eating these, so, well, forget it. Let's go back." Oh Ming glanced at him. Su Cheng nodded quickly and ran away with his tail between his legs. Oh Ming glanced at the lunchbox that had been opened. The porridge looked bland. He shook his head and said, "You're lucky. I can't eat such bland food. This is your reward." Yu Lily looked at him and sneered. She pulled the quilt over her head and decided to ignore him. "Hungry. I'm starving." He didn't have any strength left in his body. But she didn't want this kind of handout. Yu Lily closed her eyes, covered her head, and curled up. She pressed her legs against her stomach and tried to sleep. His eyes were tightly shut, but his stomach soon started to hurt. He was hungry. Chapter 833. Get out. Yu Lily lifted the quilt over her head again. "Oh Ming, are you a bitch? You hate me so much. Why are you still pretending here? It's disgusting." Oh Ming's action of pulling her quilt paused. His internal organs seemed to be stirred by her words, and he felt pain everywhere. But soon, he chuckled and said, "It seems that you still have a little self-awareness. Since you have this awareness, I am relieved." Yu Lily curled up in the quilt, and her heart was stuffy and painful, but she sneered, "So, can you get out? Don't hurt my eyes here." "Tut!" Oh Ming opened her quilt, grabbed her arm, forced her to sit up, and said, "I am afraid that you will run away. It is not easy to make money these days. Your medical expenses are not cheap, and it is 70,000 or 80,000 yuan." Yu Lily struggled a few times and found that she couldn't get rid of him. She sat and sneered. Her big eyes looked a little sad, which made Oh Ming's heart more stuffy. Yu Lily's tone was a little sour, and she said, "Do you lack this money, Master O?" "Not at all." Oh Ming grabbed her and folded the pillow next to her so that she could lean against it. Then, he pressed his hands on her shoulders. His shimmering almond-shaped eyes were half squinted, and he smiled evilly as he said slowly, "It's just that when a reptile like you puts in so much effort to pay off a debt, I feel especially good." Yu Lily breathed quickly, raised her foot, and wanted to stretch out her leg to kick him. But her strength was so poor that she couldn't make any threat at all. Oh Ming raised his eyebrows slightly and pointed to the porridge and side dishes next to him. "If you don't eat, how can you have the strength to beat me?" Yu Lily looked at him and suddenly didn't understand what he wanted to do. Closing her eyes, Yu Lily didn't want to look at him. "Eating something is convenient to work, isn't it?" Oh Ming's voice was soft and slow, as if he was talking to Yu Lily, but also to himself. "Work, disgusting." Yu Lily was even more disgusted. She closed her eyes and put her head down, trying to stay away from him. Ming saw her small movement, and his eyes were slightly gloomy. He stretched out his big hand, held her head, straightened her up, and ordered, "Open your mouth." Lily pursed her lips, turned her head, and didn't even open her eyes. "If you don't finish eating today, I'll put all the financial losses I've suffered over the past few days on you." Ming sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her. He calculated and said, "It's not much. After all, the business in the capital isn't that big. It's only a few tens of millions." Lily was furious. She suddenly opened her eyes and scolded, "You are so shameless." Ming took the opportunity to stuff the spoon into her mouth. Lily was shocked and stunned. At the same time, she became angrier. She tilted her head and spat out all the porridge he had forced into her mouth. It spilled over the quilt. Lily spat out the last bit of residue, grabbed the quilt, and wiped it on Ming's body. Ming sat where he was, and his suit was a mess. Seeing this, Lily felt inexplicably refreshed. With a sneer, Lily moved her body down and let herself lie down. However, Ming's expression became more and more unsightly. He pulled her up forcefully and pressed her body against the bedside. He growled, "Eat it." Lily tightened her mouth and didn't move. Ming Yao took a spoonful of porridge and stuffed it into her mouth. Chapter 834. Seeing this, Ming was furious. But it was at this moment that he smiled. Putting down the bowl in his hand, Ming held the spoon in one hand and reached out with the other hand. Under Lily's horrified eyes, he grabbed her chin. With the force of his palm, Ming forced her mouth open and poured all the porridge in the spoon into her mouth. His big hand pinched her face and forced her to chew. But Lily clenched her teeth and closed her eyes tightly. The burning pain from her cheeks made her tears come out. There was no part of her body that didn't hurt. But at the same time, in addition to the pain, there was only a kind of numbness like a walking corpse, and she gasped uninterestedly. "Living is really boring. But why don't you let me die?" Lily's chest was tearing pain, and tears came out in a moment. Ming saw her tears, and the determination on his face suddenly wavered. Unconsciously, his palm had slightly loosened. Lily opened her eyes, reached out, and tried to remove his hand. Ming did not insist and slowly loosened his grip. Lily's eyes were red, and she stared at him with hatred. Ming only felt that there was a heat wave rolling in his chest, overwhelming him and suffocating him. When he was about to speak, he saw Lily open her mouth and spit. The porridge in her mouth was all sprayed out. Ming closed his eyes at the same time. His face and body were full of half-chewed rice. He reached out and wiped his hands, which were full of filth. When he looked down, it was a tragic sight. "I have never tried to be so dirty." Seeing this, Ming's face was as dark as the bottom of a pot. He clenched his fists, gritted his teeth, and growled, "You Lily." Lily laughed with a pleasant feeling, looked at him, and gave him the middle finger. Seeing this, Ming also laughed, threw the spoon in his hand, and stretched out his hands. Seeing this, Lily closed her eyes, raised her face, and exposed her neck. Seeing this, Ming was even more heartbroken, and the uncontrollable discomfort eroded him wave by wave. Did she think he was going to strangle her? His throat felt empty, and his hands slowly fell. One fell on her shoulder, and the other fell on the side of her face. He whispered, "Why are you doing this?" His voice was low and slow, carrying an indescribable gentleness. Lily felt a thump and suddenly opened her eyes. Her weak and listless eyes stared at him. "Why do you have to make me angry? You know that when I'm not angry, I'm very gentle to you, aren't I?" Ming's voice was gentle, as if he had returned to the past. Lily's eyes were sore, and she almost shed tears. She bit her lower lip and stared at him with burning eyes. From her angle, she could clearly see the red veins in his eyes. Ming withdrew one hand and took out a handkerchief from his pocket. He gently wiped his body with it. His movements were elegant and noble. In a low voice, he said, "What good will it do to offend me? It will only make your current situation more difficult. You Lily, weren't you very smart before? Did you choke on gas and ruin your brain?" Clearly, he wasn't angry. Clearly, he was very gentle. But at that moment, you Lily felt that she was in an extremely sorry state, and she was also extremely humble. As he said, she was embarrassed. You Lily chuckled, and her eyes were wet. She sarcastically said, "Maybe it's because you hit the child." Chapter 835. The child had always been the longest and deepest thorn between them. From the moment the blood flowed all over the bed, it had been deeply piercing them. As long as it was touched, it would be a heart-wrenching pain. 2 children, his twins. The woman he loved so much had lost them. Oh Ming's face became obscure, and the chill was like the ice and snow after the heavy snow in winter. It was bone-chilling. You Lily looked at his expression and smiled. She looked up at the head of the bed, and tears quietly flowed down. But in her mouth, there was such a strange and sick laughter. Just like 4 years ago, at the moment when the child was lost, her face was full of revenge joy. So cruel, Oh Ming stood up from the bed and strode out. You Lily suddenly relaxed. She had no strength left in her body. She leaned on the bed and sobbed in a low voice. He left. He was angry with her. Hiss, she thought that Oh Ming would want to kill her and help her get rid of it. How good. Dying in his hands would be the happiest thing in the past 4 years. But he didn't. You Lily opened her eyes and glanced at the messy quilt. She gently opened it and got out of bed barefoot. The autumn night was very cool. You Lily shivered and walked out of the door. There were only a few lights on in the corridor, and there was no one. She walked out slowly. You Lily pressed the elevator button and saw that the highest floor here was only the 13th floor. After pressing the button for the highest floor, You Lily leaned against the elevator, feeling weak. Ding! The elevator arrived at the station. When the door opened, You Lily saw a corridor. After walking for a long time, she saw the safe passage. If he went up, it would be the real top floor, right? The coldness eroded everywhere, and it was pervasive. You Lily was shivering from the cold. She climbed upstairs and saw a locked iron door. She pulled the iron bolt, and the violent cold wind blew over. You Lily was caught off guard and was hit by the great force of the wind, and she fell down the stairs. Bang! The iron door was blown by the wind and slammed into the wall behind. You Lily fell down, and the back of her head hurt. His body, which was weak to begin with, twitched in pain at this moment, unable to get up. So painful, You Lily's tears were blurred. Her whole body was sore and weak, and she was in so much pain that she did not dare to move. Why was it so difficult to die? She failed to commit suicide by turning on the gas, and she was pulled down to commit suicide by jumping into the water. Now, she just wanted to jump off a building, but even the weather was against her. Could it be that she had committed so many sins that even the heavens were unwilling to let her die peacefully? You Lily lay on the ground and rested for a long time before she had a little strength. You Lily struggled to get up, but she couldn't stand anymore. She used both hands to climb up the stairs, dragging her body. The cold wind outside made her shiver. Suddenly, the sound of alarms rang out all around them. They were caught off guard. You Lily was so scared that she shivered. Her legs went soft, and she slid down the stairs. Gritting her teeth, You Lily climbed up. When she finally reached the stairs, she found that the top floor was full of hospital gowns and white coats. Walking up and stumbling to the edge of the top floor, You Lily felt a rare sense of relaxation. Free, I'm going to be free, You Lily. Chapter 836. At 1:00 in the morning, alarms suddenly sounded everywhere in the hospital. All the doctors and nurses on night shift were startled and hurriedly ran out. The patient in room V8 is missing. Everyone, look for her. The patient in room V8 is missing. She has a strong intention to commit suicide. Please pay attention. Oh Ming ran from one room to another and looked around. Finally, he grabbed a nurse and asked loudly, "Where is the monitoring room? Where is your monitoring room?" The nurse was shocked by him. She stuttered and told him the location of the surveillance room. He immediately let go of her and disappeared in a flash. However, before he went to the so-called monitoring room, Oh Ming suddenly thought of a place. He pressed the elevator and went directly to the 13th floor. The wind was very strong. Yu Lily was trembling all over her body. The railing on the top floor was unexpectedly high. Yu Lily tried her best to drag several things under the railing, and then there was a little height. Stepping on it, Yu Lily's hand curled on the highest handrail and lifted her foot up. But before she hooked on the handrail, she suddenly heard a thunderous voice coming from behind, "Yu Lily." Yu Lily's heart skipped a beat, and she was scared to death. Her body softened, and the whole person just fell down. The ground was rough cement. Yu Lily fell and felt pain all over her body. She screamed and lost all her strength. Oh Ming's heart was empty. He quickly ran over and helped her up. Noticing that she was shaking badly, he felt even more angry and scolded her. "Are you F***king sick? Yu Lily, don't you know to wear a coat on such a cold day?" As he spoke, he took off his coat and covered her body with it. Yu Lily felt warm and opened her eyes weakly. It was very dark, and the light outside was all blocked by the railing next to her. Yu Lily's eyes were so blurred that she couldn't see his expression at all. However, these words were clearly transmitted into her ears. With a low laugh, Yu Lily's tears suddenly rolled down, and she helplessly let herself cry. "Oh Ming, let me die, okay? I beg you, let me die, okay? Why do you save me? Why don't you let me die?" His weak and powerless voice was filled with humble pleading. Oh Ming was deeply hurt by such words. Her heartbeat affected her eyes, causing them to become moist. Yu Lily didn't notice Oh Ming's strangeness. She lowered her head and burst into tears. She begged, "Don't meddle in other people's business. Oh Ming, I beg you. I have nothing left. Now I don't even have the right to seek death." "Who said you don't have anything?" Oh Ming held her in his arms. His voice trembled. His throat was empty. He whispered, "Whatever you want, I'll give it to you." When Yu Lily heard that, she stopped crying. Oh Ming held her with both hands and pressed her head against his chest. "No matter what, I cannot die." Oh Ming rubbed her short hair and said, "Live well, then there's hope for everything, isn't it? This is what you told me. Have you forgotten?" Yu Lily could clearly feel his presence. At the same time that her vocal cords vibrated, her chest also vibrated gently. His voice was like an echo, entering her ears. Chapter 837. At that time, when she said this, she was wearing a fiery red coat, with her long hair draped over her shoulders, and her little face was as proud as a peacock. Her posture was arrogant and proud. At that time, she lived like a queen beside him. Bold, proud, and wild. Who didn't envy her? Who didn't like her? How good it was in those days. But why did she leave? Why did she leave? The so-called first love was just one of the excuses. Was the so-called freedom really so important? Did she really get the so-called freedom? He only knew that after leaving him, she had a bad life. Very bad. Yu Lily, who used to be optimistic, wanted to commit suicide several times. When Yu Lily heard this, she suddenly laughed as if she had heard a joke. Lowering her head against his chest, Yu Lily whispered in a muffled voice, "Yes, I am hypocritical. Who can always be positive?" When the hot blood was defeated by reality again and again, even Yu Lily couldn't get up again. In the past, she firmly believed that there was no obstacle that couldn't be overcome. People who seek death at the slightest provocation are simply unreasonable. But when it happened to her, Yu Lily could finally understand why they didn't want to live. Sometimes, it wasn't due to external factors. It was just because she couldn't stand it, that's all. Tired. Too tired. The world was so big, and no one would notice that she was missing. Maybe Oh Ming would care about it for a while and feel sorry in his heart. Ah, you Lily died. What a pity. I lost such a fun toy. But. Sad. Sad. There would be no. She used to think that he loved her deeply, but she was just deceiving herself. She couldn't afford to be with such a proud man. Oh Ming was stunned. After a moment of silence, he whispered, "You Lily, don't let me look down on you. When did you look up to me?" You Lily's crying had completely stopped, and she chuckled. "What's your identity, and what's my identity? Don't think that people are stupid. In fact, no one is stupid." Oh Ming didn't speak again. He stood up, pulled her up, and carried her. Then, he walked down the stairs. Several doctors and nurses were preparing to go to the top floor. When they saw Oh Ming holding You Lily down, they were all stunned. He made way for them, pressed the elevator button, and watched them go down. You Lily fell hard, with bruises all over her body. The nurse took off her clothes and applied medicine on her. With her upper body exposed, You Lily was still lying on the bed. About 10 minutes later, the nurse was sent away by Oh Ming after emergency treatment of the wound. Just then, Su Qing once again brought over a hot porridge. After handing it to Oh Ming, he consciously left. Oh Ming personally opened the lunchbox and said firmly, "Eat something." You Lily lay on the bed pretending to be a corpse and did not respond at all. "If you don't eat, I'll have to feed you with my mouth." You Lily opened her eyes. On her pale face, it was hard to see any emotion. She sneered and said, "I haven't brushed my teeth for several days." This man had a morbid obsession with cleanliness. He would never insist on it. Indeed, after hearing this, Oh Ming's originally calm face suddenly became a little messy. Seeing the change in his expression, You Lily closed her eyes in relief. However, suddenly Oh Ming reached out to help her up, and then her lips were soft. You Lily suddenly opened her eyes as if she was struck by lightning. Dash. Chapter 838. Oh Ming held her head and looked at her with his eyes open. You Lily opened her eyes wide and looked up at him in disbelief. However, a moment later, something warm, wet and sticky came out of his mouth and entered her mouth. So disgusting, You Lily almost vomited. Subconsciously frowning, You Lily tried to push him away. But it was useless. Oh Ming held her face with one hand and supported her back with the other. Sensing her struggle, he immediately tightened his elbows and held her hands in place. He pressed his whole body against her and pressed her under his body. You Lily frowned tightly and closed her eyes as if she couldn't bear to look at it. She tried to turn her head away. Oh Ming raised her head again and let her throat straighten, and the food soon flowed down naturally. You Lily unconsciously swallowed a lot of it, which made her hair stand on end. Oh Ming finally released her, scooped another spoon, looked at her, and raised his eyebrows slightly. "Continue?" You Lily retched, and a little tears oozed out of her eyes. Seeing this, Oh Ming scooped a spoonful for himself. While eating, he said, "You are the one who hasn't brushed your teeth for a few days." "I haven't vomited yet." "Why are you retching?" "Oh Ming. You are getting more and more disgusting. You are not bad either." Oh Ming took a bite and found it quite delicious. "You actually like such a strange way of eating. Do you want to continue?" You Lily stared at him. Her throat was very dry, and she didn't spit anything out. Oh Ming took a sip, put it in his mouth, and was about to move toward her. You Lily turned her head, looked disgusted, and shouted, "I will eat it myself." Hearing that, Oh Ming put down the spoon, put his hands under her armpits, and lifted her up. He overlapped two high pillows and let her lean against the headboard. Then, he pushed the small table on the bed over, put the bowl in front of her, and motioned her to eat. You Lily looked at the salty porridge, which was white and had a little color. She struggled to raise her hands. Her hands were also very sore, and her fingers were holding the spoon, trembling slightly. Looking at Oh Ming's expression, Yu Lily picked up the spoon, but she couldn't hold it steadily, and the porridge on it fell on the quilt that had just been changed. Seeing this, Oh Ming narrowed his eyes and chuckled. He took 2 pieces of paper towel and wiped the porridge off. Then, he picked up the bowl and scooped up a spoonful of porridge to place in front of her. Yu Lily glanced at him and shrank back in resistance. Oh Ming faintly raised his eyebrows with an obvious warning. She pursed her lips, opened her mouth, and ate the porridge. It was quite tasty. It was quite delicious. Yu Lily didn't feel hungry at first, but after a few bites, she felt her stomach ache. So hungry, after eating half a bowl, Yu Lily didn't want to eat anymore. Oh Ming ate the rest of the porridge himself. Faced with Yu Lily's strange gaze, he calmly said, "This was supposed to be my supper." In other words, it was Yu Lily who took his supper. Yu Lily lowered her head and felt unspeakably ironic. How could he act like this so naturally? Just like before. Didn't he know that this would easily cause misunderstandings? This would make her think too much. Lowering her eyes, Yu Lily gently pushed the small table away and said, "If you're done eating, you can leave now." Chapter 839. Oh Ming packed up his things and put away the small table. He looked at her with a faint smile and said, "I'll sleep here tonight, in case you run away again." Ha! Yu Lily felt a little funny. Who do you think you are? Do you care whether I live or die? Anyway, I used to be your sugar daddy. Oh Ming leaned forward, scaring Yu Lily and making her shrink back. Seeing her reaction, Oh Ming smiled with satisfaction. He put his hands on both sides of her. With an indescribable evil tone, he said with a faint smile, "I'm looking forward to our next cooperation. I want to play the sugar daddy and mistress cosplay again." Raising one hand, he lifted her chin, narrowed his eyes slightly, and whispered, "It's just like before. It's very exciting and fun, isn't it?" Yu Lily looked at him, gritted her teeth, and raised her hand to hit him in the face. But before she raised it, it was blocked by Oh Ming in the middle. Oh Ming raised his eyebrows and looked at her with a smile. "You want to hit me?" Yu Lily sneered. "More than that, I want to kill you. You have to pay with your life, you. Do you think I will be afraid?" Yu Lily looked up at him fearlessly. "In my current situation, I can't wait to die. My life is worthless. If I can kill you, it will be worth it, Mr. O." Oh Ming was speechless. She almost blurted out the name, but after saying it, Yu Lily was surprised to find that something was wrong. Seeing Oh Ming's more and more meaningful expression, her cheeks unconsciously burned. With an evil smile in his eyes, Oh Ming said softly, "Then you try. I will sleep here with you today. Find a chance to kill me." As he spoke, he had straightened up, and his long fingers slowly unbuttoned the coat of his suit. Yu Lily sneered, stared at him, turned over, and lay down. She covered the top of her head with the quilt and closed her eyes. Oh Ming sat on the sofa, moved the computer on the side, and began to work. After noticing that Yu Lily had fallen asleep, he looked at the time. It was already past 3 in the morning. It was very late. She picked up the phone and opened WeChat, sent a few messages to Li Sicheng, and then closed the computer, lying on the sofa, and fell asleep. It was a silent night. The nurse came in early in the morning to check on Yu Lily. Oh Ming was awakened by the sound of the door opening. He looked at his watch. It was already past 7 in the morning. In winter, the sky brightened very late. Picking up her phone, she saw several missed calls from Li Sicheng. She watched Yu Lily being examined by the nurse. After reminding her to keep an eye on her, she walked out. She called Li Sicheng, and he quickly picked up. "Second brother." Li Sicheng's voice sounded casual. From time to time, he could hear the laughter of children, which made Oh Ming secretly envious. Li Sicheng seemed to be in a good mood and asked, is it urgent? It's urgent. All right, wait for me. With that, he hung up the phone. Lily was helped into the bathroom by the nurse. She asked for a toothbrush, toothpaste, and a towel to brush her teeth and wash her face before coming out. She looked much better than she did 2 days ago. Oh Ming looked at her short hair, which only reached her ears, and the thin, yellow face hidden under the short hair. His heart ached. You don't look like a human anymore, yet you're still so stubborn. Which son of a bitch spoiled him to this extent? Dash. Chapter 840. Oh Ming washed up in the bathroom of the ward. When he went out, Su Cheng had already brought breakfast. 2 servings. Seeing Oh Ming come out, Su Cheng pretended not to see him. He opened the lunchbox for Lily and said, "Have some porridge. It's good for your stomach." While talking, he had helped Lily prepare the side dishes and porridge, and thoughtfully put the spoon on the table where Lily could easily reach it. Lily saw the dark circles under his eyes, which were obviously caused by hard work. She felt a little sympathetic and said sincerely, "Thank you." Su Cheng smiled. When he was about to speak, he suddenly felt a chill on his back. His back was stiff. Su Cheng quickly waved his hand and said, "You are too polite. Take your time. I'll go first." Turning his head, he saw Oh Ming's obviously unhappy expression. He hurriedly said, "Master Oh, I'll go to the company first." Okay. Su Cheng secretly breathed a sigh of relief. But when he was almost at the door, he suddenly heard Oh Ming's voice. He said, "Remember to have lunch." "Yes." Su Cheng responded and ran away. Lily saw that he couldn't wait to leave. She unconsciously bent her lips, looked down at the breakfast, and raised her hand to pick up the spoon. After eating something last night and a night of rest, Lily's strength had recovered a lot. Oh Ming just glanced at her, sat on the sofa next to her, and started to eat. While eating breakfast, he didn't forget to watch Lily's movements. After seeing that she was really eating breakfast, he was relieved. After Lily was full, she folded the food and pushed the small table aside. Then, her eyes fell on the TV remote control on the edge of the sofa. The sofa was a little far from the bed, about 4 or 5 steps away. Lily was bored. She stared at the remote control and looked at the needle in her hand. Lily measured the length of the infusion tube and found that it couldn't support her to walk to the other side, so she propped herself up and lifted the quilt. Oh Ming was looking at the computer. He saw her movement, looked up, and asked, "What do you want to do?" Lily ignored him and reached out to take the bag of medicine. But before she put down her hand, it was taken by Oh Ming. Oh Ming was a little tall. He was more than 6 feet tall, almost a head taller than her. Lily only felt a strong sense of oppression, subconsciously took a step back, but felt that it was too useless, so she stiffened her neck and looked at him. "What do you want to do?" Oh Ming asked again. "To the toilet?" His sudden gentleness made Lily's heart skip a beat. Looking away, Lily reached out to take the medicine bag from Oh Ming's hand, but he pulled it back. Lily looked at him, slightly raised his eyebrows, and did not speak. Lily looked at him. After a long while, she said, "I want to watch TV." Oh Ming couldn't help but smile. He turned his head to look at the TV remote control on the side of the sofa. As he walked, he said, "Yesterday you wanted to die, and today you want to watch TV. Why are you so fickle?" "Ming, you Ming Lily," he said. "Cheng, you, I, you, Cheng, I Ming you, Ming. Cheng. Cheng." Chapter 841. Lily didn't receive it, and the remote control fell on the bed. This made Lily even more angry, and she went back to bed angrily. Oh Ming hung up the medicine bag again and returned to the sofa to sit down. Lily turned on the TV and found a variety show to watch. This was an old show that had been around for more than 10 years. It specially invited some stars to come and play games together, and the ratings had always been very high. Lily watched for a while, but she couldn't find anything funny. Instead, she was even more upset. She sneaked a glance at Ming and heard the sound of his typing on the keyboard. It could be seen that he was very busy with work. But why is he still here? Is it really just to humiliate me and prevent me from committing suicide that he stayed here for so long? He shouldn't waste so much time for things that are not worth it. Is it possible that he still likes me? Thinking of this possibility, Lily's heart suddenly accelerated. But soon, she felt bitter in her heart. It can't be. If he really still liked her, why would he insult her like that? In the past, he couldn't wait to hold me in the palm of his hand and give me all the best. Although she was dismissive at that time, she saw how good Ming was to her. Maybe, this was the price. When she finally found out that she had fallen in love with Ming, God took back all the good things that had been given to her in order to punish her severely. The laughter from the variety show was constantly coming from the TV, but Lily felt bored. She stared at the TV, but there was no focus. Ming glanced at her, stood up, and walked over to her. Lily didn't notice that he had come to her side. The sudden dark shadow shocked her. Looking up, she found that Ming had reached out. Lily shrank and subconsciously shouted, "What do you want to do?" Ming's eyes darkened, and he reached out to press the call bell not far from Lily's bed. After pressing the bell, Ming turned around and returned to the sofa to sit down. Lily breathed a sigh of relief and looked up at the infusion bottle above her head. She found that there was only a bottom of the liquid above, and even she didn't notice it. The nurse quickly came to help her remove the needle and then went out. The whole ward was indescribably quiet. Only the sound of the variety show on the TV could be heard. The laughter on the TV was endless, but the atmosphere in reality was somewhat dull. Ming closed the computer and glanced at her. He walked to the water dispenser and poured a glass of water. Then he went to a cart under the TV and fiddled with it. Soon, he walked to Lily. He handed her a glass of water and a packet of medicine. Lily looked at the Western medicine, pursed her lips, took the water, and stared at the medicine. Just looking at it made her mouth bitter. Ming opened the bag and poured all the pills into her hand. He didn't say a word the whole time. Lily looked at the medicine and drank a glass of water. Finally, she smacked her lips and looked painful. Ming poured her another glass of water, but he wasn't in a hurry to give it to her. Instead, he put it in the cart and walked out. When he came back, he was holding something in his hand. After bringing the water over, he opened his palm. Chapter 842. Lily reached out to grab the candy, but Ming took it back. Lily was annoyed and looked up at him. Ming did not speak, but handed the water to her and glanced at the medicine in her hand. His meaning was self-evident. Seeing this, Lily reluctantly took the water and swallowed the medicine, but she saw that Ming had already removed the wrapper of the milk candy. Shocked, Lily reached out and grabbed the candy, removed the remaining wrapper, and put it in her mouth. Ming unconsciously softened his eyes. After throwing away the cup, he picked up the suit next to him and went out. Soon a nurse came in and looked at Lily. Ming should have left. So, he sent someone to monitor me? Pursing her lips, Lily turned on the TV to watch out of boredom, but she didn't like any of the channels. Looking around, Lily finally looked at Ming's notebook. Asking the nurse to bring it to her, Lily put down the small dining table and turned on the computer. However, she found that there was a password. Ming's computer password. It shouldn't be the same password as before. Lily frowned and entered his mobile phone number. Error. She entered it again. It was his birthday. Error. Ming wrong. Ming did not like to change passwords, and these had some special meaning for him. However, there were a few possible passwords that were displayed incorrectly. Could it be that he had changed his password? In the past few years, had he remembered other numbers very clearly? Lily thought about it and entered the password she had used before. The computer was turned on with a light sound. Yu Lily's heart was beating wildly. Looking at the open page, she sat blankly. In the past, the password he often used recently was her birthday. He actually still used this password. Why? The palpitation that should not have been ignited quickly in her heart. Yu Lily's mind became more and more chaotic, looking at the screen full of information and documents, and the email page that had not been closed yet. However, she inadvertently glanced at an email title, Capital Rend Technology Company, Limited Acquisition Plan. Capital Rend, isn't this Lida's company? How could it be? How could Oh Ming acquire such a small company? Even Yu Lily looked down on such a company, let alone Oh Ming. If it weren't for his high salary, Yu Lily wouldn't have stayed there. Now, Oh Ming was buying this kind of lousy company? Why? Could it really be that he had too much money and was buying it for fun? Yu Lily clicked on it and found that the document had already been downloaded by Oh Ming. When she opened it, the estimated price and operating costs were far lower than what Yu Lily knew. And it was much lower. Although Lida's company wasn't big, it shouldn't be so cheap, right? Moreover, Lida's importance to this company couldn't be underestimated. He wouldn't easily agree to sell it. Could it be that he had gone bankrupt? Yu Lily's heart was beating very fast. The more she read, the more shocked she was. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, she saw Oh Ming's figure. Shocked, she quickly closed the document and pressed the sleep button. While he was walking over, she turned on the computer again and pretended to enter the password. Chapter 843. Yu Lily pretended to be calm, pressed the enter key a few times, and said, "What is your password?" "I can't open it." Oh Ming squinted at her for a moment, then went forward and closed the computer. He took the computer and sat on the edge of the sofa, not answering her question. The nurse saw Oh Ming coming over, said hello at the same time, and went out. At this moment, Oh Ming had changed his clothes. He should have found a place to take a shower and change clothes, and he looked much cleaner and more refreshed. Yu Lily pretended to be disdainful, lay down, and pulled the quilt up to cover half of her face. But she did not turn her back like before, but quietly tucked the quilt, peeking out a pair of eyes. Oh Ming seemed to notice her gaze and looked over. Yu Lily noticed it and quickly closed her eyes, pretending to sleep. Oh Ming felt something was wrong and entered the password to open the computer. The page on the computer seemed to be different from when he just left. It was opened. Password, he looked at Yu Lily, who was pretending to sleep on the bed. "What did you see?" Oh Ming slid his finger on the touchpad and asked slowly. Yu Lily felt a little guilty, but still pretended to be calm. She opened her eyes and looked at him with a puzzled look. "What?" Oh Ming slightly raised his eyebrows and chuckled, but his face was cold. "Don't touch my things in the future." His voice was gloomy, with displeasure. Oh Ming's sullen face made Yu Lily feel even more guilty. She sneered, "Who wants it?" Although she said so, she couldn't help but feel jealous. She turned around with the quilt and closed her eyes. "Yu Lily, you really think too highly of yourself." When Li Xiqing woke up, he saw a few WeChat messages on his phone. It was Oh Ming. After calling several times and no one answered, he simply threw the phone aside and turned around to hug his wife. Su Qianxi was still in a daze. Being hugged like this, she habitually burrowed into his arms and then fell asleep again. Li Xiqing held her in his arms and unconsciously hugged her, his big hand stroking her waist. Well, she was fat again. So fat. She moaned and took his hand away. He lowered his head and whispered, "Get up, Mrs. Li, shut up." She reached out and covered his mouth, refusing to open her eyes. He turned over and pinched her nose, saying, "You're getting lazier." "Well. Go away. I want to sleep." She frowned and waved him off. He chuckled and stopped teasing her. After washing up, he went outside. He took the kids out for a run, but just after running one lap, he received a call. It was Oh Ming. When Li Jianhua saw that her father had gone to answer the phone, she immediately took the lead to slack off. She called brother Mosen to catch worms together. After hanging up, he looked at the kids running around and was about to put his phone back when it rang again. This time it was Cheng Yu. It had been a while since Cheng Yu returned to the company to work. Perhaps because of Rong Rui, her working ability was not inferior to before, but more efficient than before. As soon as he picked up, he heard a piece of explosive news. "Boss, we found Bo Xiao." Bo Xiao. Chapter 844. In the colorful Yunnan, the sun was shining brightly. In the shabby alley, there were 10 children running around, laughing and playing, and the sound of children crying could be heard. Today's weather was very good, and the sun was very bright. An old man dressed in beautiful and neat ethnic clothes moved a small stool and sat in front of the door, watching the children playing, and from time to time said a few words that could not be understood. Rong Anna was drying clothes on the roof, humming a tune. After drying all the clothes, she stood on the railing on the edge of the roof, looked at the golden sun hanging in the distance, and stretched. With one hand on her slightly bulging belly, Rong Anna's body was warmed by the sun, and at the same time, her face was also full of the glory of maternal love. In the distance, there were domestic dogs barking, and the sound of electric car horns came up. The mood was quiet and peaceful. It was good. If she could live like this forever, it would be a good choice. In a beautiful small city, doing a small business. With a husband and children by her side, working at sunrise and resting at sunset, however, the cruel reality had turned this simple idea into an extravagant hope. Rong Anna looked down and inadvertently saw a few men in simple casual clothes, looking at each other and carefully hiding at the end of the alley. Some of them were smoking, but their postures were tall and straight. They were all very healthy and strong. One of them was holding a mobile phone and making a phone call, and just on the other side of the box, there was another line of people standing. Rong Anna immediately had an ominous premonition. After looking around, she finally saw a car that looked like a police car about 2 alleys away. But she could only see a little bit, and it was difficult to see the whole picture. Shocked, Rong Anna carried the basket to dry clothes and ran down from the top floor. Back to the small house she rented, Rong Anna pushed the door and went in. Bo Xiao was on the phone in the room, and his face didn't seem to be very good. Rong Anna went in and saw his expression, but she didn't speak immediately. Bo Xiao's mood seemed to be rotten, and he shouted at the phone, "Old Su, you are so boring, at least." "Hello." The phone was hung up, and Bo Xiao was furious and scolded, "Damn it. Xiao, what happened? Old Su's group of grandsons, didn't they say they were going to pick up our goods last time? They haven't moved for so long. I just called to ask, and he said he doesn't want the goods anymore. *T. When Rong Anna heard this, her face changed. Old Su's goods couldn't be moved out last time, so we took over. How can he, now that you see that we can't do it, you don't want to work with us anymore? When we make a comeback, we will definitely take revenge." Bo Xiao placed his hands on the table and scratched his head in frustration. "No, we can't just sit here and do nothing. Anna, let's go." Rong Anna frowned all the time. She stepped forward and said, "Xiao, there may be police outside." Bo Xiao was shocked and looked up at her. "What?" Rong Anna grabbed his hand, looked at him and said, "On both sides of the alley, there is no one blocking the back door. Now let's go from the back door." Seeing this, Bo Xiao also understood the seriousness of the matter. Chapter 845. As soon as they opened the door, they saw 3 men standing at the door. They were wearing casual clothes, but all of them looked at them coldly. Both Bo Xiao and Rong Anna's faces changed, and their hands clasped tightly together. One of the leaders took out his police ID and said, "I am Zhou Minxia of the XX Crime Squad. Now there is sufficient evidence that you are suspected of smuggling, drug trafficking, and other illegal transactions. Please come with us." Seeing this, Bo Xiao smiled elegantly and said unhurriedly, "Officer, I'm a good citizen. Did you find the wrong person?" "Bo Xiao, wrong Anna, we are arresting you. Let's go." A few people came up and surrounded them from left and right. The rest of the people searched the room. Rong Anna and Bo Xiao were both arrested and quickly escorted downstairs. Many people gathered around and recognized Rong Anna and Bo Xiao at a glance, the two temporary guests who were incompatible with them. Rong Anna and Bo Xiao were forced into the police car, and the two were sitting in the front and back. Without any precaution, they were taken to the police station. Qingyu felt a little lost all day. At lunch at home, Rong Rui noticed something was wrong with her. Giving her a piece of meat, he asked casually, "Are you thinking of me?" She glanced at him and called, "Rong Rui." "Yes." "Why did you like me in the first place?" "Because you are good-looking." Rong Rui replied without thinking, coaxing the child while eating. "Really?" "Yes." "Not because of other purposes?" Qingyu looked at him, a little emotional. Rong Rui paused, and his amber eyes deepened. Looking at her, he asked, "What did he say to you?" Qingyu heard the words, shook her head, and felt a little frustrated. "No, I found it myself. You and Rong Anna are cousins. You provided the news of Rong Anna and Bo Xiao to the police. You gave them money to let them escape, and then reported their movements. Why did you do this? Isn't she your cousin?" "Yes." Rong Rui put down his chopsticks, looked at her, and said, "Rong Anna is my cousin, and Su Qianxi is also my cousin. Anna and Bo Xiao have made a big mistake. I gave them money to test them. The amount of cash I gave them was enough for them to escape. If they had withdrawn the money from abroad, would have pretended that nothing had happened, but they were still in the country. The border between China and Myanmar. So, you betrayed them? They or you, I can only choose one side." Rong Rui gazed at her and said, "Bo Xiao is extremely mean and very vengeful. If he is still in the country, he will definitely hurt Li Xicheng and Su Qianxi. They are very important to you, aren't they? If they had left the realm, I could have made it so that they would never be able to return, but they didn't. It's obvious that they have other plans." Rong Rui's eyes darkened. No matter what their plans are, they are doomed to fail. Instead of letting them make mistakes again and again, it is better to let them spend the rest of their lives in prison. "Did you know that Rong Anna is pregnant?" Qingyu couldn't bear it. "Rong Anna will give birth in prison. Why at this time?" Chapter 846. Qingyu was humorous and did not speak again. Rong Ponpon's little face turned red and she began to cry. She waved her little fists and kicked her legs unhappily. Rong Rui coaxed the child, stood up, and sent the child to Qingyu, whispering, "Come on, mommy will hold you." Qingyu took the child over, and the little baby suddenly became well-behaved. A pair of amber-colored watery eyes, which were the same as Rong Rui's, looked at her and blinked. Qingyu's heart was almost melted by the cuteness. She chuckled and tapped her little nose. "Li Xicheng is not at the company?" "Yes, they went to the capital." Qingyu held the child and lifted the little guy up. "It seems that they went to help Ming. I don't know the specifics. Anyway, there is nothing to do in the company these 2 days, so I was lazy." "Okay." Yu Lily slept until the afternoon. Her stomach was growling, but she did not want to get up and wake up. Vaguely, she seemed to hear a familiar voice. It was a soft female voice. Yu Lily opened her eyes and looked toward the source of the sound. Just one glance was enough to wake her up. Yu Lily got up and exclaimed, "Qianqian?" Su Qianxi heard Yu Lily's cry and turned her head to look over. With a smile on her face, she immediately saw Yu Lily's hair and said, "Did you get a haircut? Short hair is so beautiful." Yu Lily rubbed her messy short hair, combed it, and looked behind Su Qianxi. Li Xicheng and Ming were sitting on the sofa, talking about something. Su Qianxi walked over to Yu Lily and said, "How do you feel? Do you feel uncomfortable anywhere?" Yu Lily saw Su Qianxi and was inexplicably moved. After being ridiculed by Ming for so long, it was the first time that Yu Lily had heard such a greeting. It was a lie to say that she was not moved. Yu Lily had never felt so close to Su Qianxi. Sniffling, her eyes were red, Yu Lily shook her head and said, "No." Su Qianxi saw her red eyes and smiled. She seemed a little helpless and said, "If not, pack up and leave the hospital. You don't feel good in the hospital. If there is no major problem, don't stay in the hospital. I can be discharged." Yu Lily's eyes lit up. Of course. She went to the back and took a paper bag. "I bought you some clothes. Put them on, and let's go eat together." "Yeah." Yu Lily was a little excited and took the paper bag to the bathroom. Yu Lily hadn't showered for several days. She didn't know if it was an illusion or not, but she felt that her body stank. There was a towel in the bathroom. Yu Lily wet it, wrung it out, and wiped her body. After making sure there was no smell, he changed into the clothes Su Qianxi brought. Inside and out, but it was a little big. Looking at the numbers, they were all the smallest. Yu Lily tugged at her clothes, put on her coat, and walked out again. As soon as they walked out, everyone's eyes fell on Yu Lily. Ming's heart ached as he watched. In just a few days, Yu Lily had lost even more weight. Under his ear-length short hair, his face was as sharp as a palm, and the dark circles under his eyes looked a little scary. Chapter 847. Su Qianxi was wearing a light cyan cashmere coat with a beautiful lace dress inside. Her long hair fell over her shoulders, making her look gentle and delicate. With a radiant face and delicate facial features, she was really beautiful. Originally, he didn't feel it when he was wearing a loose hospital gown. Now, compared with Su Qianxi, it was like a person from two different worlds. In the past, Yu Lily was more beautiful and energetic than Su Qianxi, but now, it was the complete opposite. Ming clearly noticed the change in this. He lowered his head slightly and quickly looked away. Yu Lily did not notice the change in Ming's mood. She greeted Su Qianxi with some excitement and naturally took her arm. Su Qianxi and Yu Lily walked out first. She turned to the two men and shouted, "Remember to go through the formalities. I will go with Lily first." "Okay." Li Xiqing responded with a gentle look and said, "Be careful." "I know." Su Qianxi waved her hand and took Yu Lily out. As soon as they were out of the ward, Su Qianxi couldn't help but grab her hand and say, "You are too thin. You used to be so beautiful. Why did you torture yourself to become like this? You are so ugly that you are not a ghost." Hearing that, Yu Lily couldn't help but touch her face and asked worriedly, "Is it really ugly?" Su Qianxi looked at her, nodded seriously, and said, "Yes, very ugly." Yu Lily felt a little unhappy and said, "Lend me your cosmetics." Su Qianxi smiled and said, "Let's go to the place to eat and wait for them." The two men seemed to have something to say. "They should not come so soon. We can wait for them while we do our makeup." "Okay." The two of them hailed a taxi and went to a famous local authentic Cantonese restaurant to sit down. Yu Lily's body had not fully recovered, so she could only try to eat light food. After the two of them ordered, they took out the cosmetics in the private room. Yu Lily went to the bathroom to wash her face and put on makeup. She asked, "Qianqian, why did you suddenly come to the capital? Are you accompanying your husband on a business trip?" "No." Su Qianxi looked at her with a smile on her face. Ming asked me to come." Yu Lily paused and looked at her face. Su Qianxi did not look like she was joking at all. She said, "He said that you were not in good condition and hoped that I could come to stay with you for a while. Of course, Mr. Li would not let me come alone, so he came with me. The situation is not too good?" Yu Lily looked away and smiled. Looking at the small mirror, the face in the mirror was so haggard that there was no spirit in it. It looked a little scary. It wasn't just not good, it was simply not good. If he hadn't stopped her, she would have died several times over. However, it just so happened that she didn't want to die because of his obstruction. As for the reason, even she herself did not know. Seeing Yu Lily's meaningful smile, Su Qianxi did not answer. Chapter 848. Yu Lily picked up the lipstick and put it on her hand. She put her fingers on her eyelids and asked, "What do you want to say?" "I also heard a little about you. Oh Ming's feelings for you are very deep. If it wasn't something very important, he would never have come to me. You don't have to be at odds with him. Talk to him. There's nothing you can't get through." After Yu Lily finished, she let go of her hand and looked at her. She smiled and asked, "Do you think I'm making trouble?" Su Qianxi was stunned and asked, "Isn't it?" Although Oh Ming seemed to be a bit unrestrained, he wasn't someone who would cause trouble without reason. When Yu Lily saw her expression, she took a deep breath and said, "Qianqian, the relationship between me and Oh Ming ended 4 years ago. Now, he hates me. He wants to retaliate against me. Do you know what I did 4 years ago?" "What?" Su Qianxi asked subconsciously. Yu Lily looked at her and couldn't help but hold her hand. She said, "I had an abortion of his child." Su Qianxi had heard a little about this. She looked at her with a firm look. "Why?" "There must be a reason. Yu Lily, it is not the first day I met you. There must be a reason for you to abort the child, right? Tell me." Yu Lily's hand trembled unconsciously. She turned to look at her. Yu Lily's breathing suddenly became rapid, and her eyes were red. "There must be a reason for you to abort the child, right?" It was a simple question, but it aroused all the grievances hidden in the depths of Yu Lily's heart. The first person to ask this question was Su Qianxi. It turned out to be her. As for Oh Ming, he only had an overwhelming and endless hatred for her. There was also endless humiliation and contempt for her. He had never asked her such a question. He had no doubt about the reason she had given back then. Su Qianxi clearly noticed the slight emotional changes in her. She became more and more determined in her heart. She whispered, "Tell me, Lily. What is the reason? Is there something wrong with the child?" Yu Lily's eyes were sore, and tears fell all at once. With a loud cry, Yu Lily leaned forward and hugged Su Qianxi tightly in her arms. Su Qianxi was startled by Yu Lily's sudden cry. When she came back to herself, Yu Lily was sobbing. Su Qianxi gently patted her back, feeling a little distressed. She whispered, "Don't cry. I just finished my makeup. Don't cry and ruin it." Yu Lily also wanted to stop, but she hugged her with both hands, and her tears flowed uncontrollably. The despair and sadness buried in the deepest part of her heart came out at this moment, and it was unstoppable. Yu Lily couldn't bear it any longer and burst into tears. After crying for a few minutes, Yu Lily calmed down a little. She released her slightly and sobbed, "Qianqian, that was my first child. Do you know? It was a pair of twins, but I miscarried them." "Twins." Hearing this word, Su Qianxi also felt a sharp pain in her heart, and she couldn't help but feel pain. "When the doctor told me that they were twins, I almost killed myself." Yu Lily almost choked from crying. She couldn't catch her breath. She took a moment to catch her breath before continuing. Oh Ming wanted twins the most, but those 2 children couldn't be kept, because... Chapter 849. Familiar footsteps came in, and Su Qianxi clearly noticed that Yu Lily's back was stiff. Looking up, she saw Li Xicheng and Oh Ming walking in and looking over here. Because of what? Oh Ming spoke with suppressed anger in his voice. It was as if he had heard something funny but was trying not to laugh out loud. He looked at Yu Lily with a pair of beautiful peach blossom eyes and raised his eyebrows slightly. "What excuse did you prepare this time? Tell me." When Yu Lily heard this, the uncontrollable tears that had been rolling down her cheeks shrank. Looking at Oh Ming's sarcastic look, Yu Lily did not speak. However, Su Qianxi was annoyed and furious. She turned her head and stared at Oh Ming. Her eyes were red, and she shouted, "You've gone too far." The simultaneous rebuke stunned the three people at the scene. Especially Oh Ming, who heard Su Qianxi's words. After a pause, he realized that she was talking about him. If it was Yu Lily who said this, Oh Ming would definitely not hesitate to ridicule back. But it was Su Qianxi who said it, sister-in-law. Oh Ming felt a little headache. Looking at Su Qianxi, he did not know what to say for a while. Su Qianxi was so distressed that her eyes were red. She stared at Oh Ming and said, "There must be a reason for a woman to hurt her own children. A mother can't bear to hurt her own children, let alone a pair of twins." She was the mother of twins, and she could understand this feeling too well. She was glad more than once that God had given her such a pair of lovely little babies. If anyone dared to hurt her children, then she was completely likely to fight with the other party. A woman was weak, but a mother was strong. I don't expect you men to understand, but you can't say this kind of thing. It's too much. Losing the children itself was very painful, and she had to bear Oh Ming's words. No wonder Yu Lily wanted to commit suicide several times. Oh Ming was speechless. And Li Xicheng, who was behind Oh Ming, pushed him from behind. His face was serious, and with an unkind expression, he said, "Yes, it's too much." Oh Ming was a little confused. He looked back at Li Xicheng and opened his eyes wide. When did the second son he knew become such a flatterer? Where was his integrity? Where was his friendship? To hell with it all. Facing his expression, Li Xicheng was not moved at all. He ordered, "Apologize." Seeing this, Su Qianxi, who looked like she was about to cry, suddenly burst into laughter. Oh Ming wanted to say something, but in the blink of an eye, he was pressed into a chair by Li Xicheng. Without mercy, Li Xicheng pressed his head and said again, "Apologize to my wife. I can't bear to bully my wife, but you, boy, made her cry as soon as you came. You've grown up. Apologize to Lily." "Why are you apologizing to me?" Su Qianxi took a tissue to wipe Yu Lily's tears, but she couldn't help smiling. Yu Lily took the tissue and bowed her head in silence. How blissful, Li Xicheng seemed to really love her. This was love, right? Unconditional tolerance and unconditional pampering. And Oh Ming was just playing with her. He said he was serious, but he was just playing seriously. The difference was huge. Chapter 850. Oh Ming squinted at Yu Lily, but did not apologize. Yu Lily also did not speak. After the dishes were served, Li Xicheng and Oh Ming were chatting happily. After the group of people had dinner, it was almost evening. Li Xicheng and Oh Ming found another place to continue chatting, while Su Qianxi took Yu Lily to the mall. Seeing the dazzling lineup of brands that she used to like, Yu Lily stood in the mirror store and felt as if she had returned to the past. Su Qianxi picked up the clothes one by one and compared them with Yu Lily's body. She said, "This looks good and suits you. Hey, this is not bad either. Good, good, good." Yu Lily was in front of the mirror, and her eyes were shining. But in front of Su Qianxi, her face was a little hot. Finally, Su Qianxi gave her a pile of clothes. Yu Lily held the pile of clothes and felt her cheeks were even redder. Su Qianxi gently pushed her and said, "Go and change it. Try it on and see if it fits." Yu Lily looked around and found that the salesperson was still a little far from here. She carefully approached Su Qianxi and whispered, "Qianqian, I don't have money. This store is so expensive." Su Qianxi heard that and was stunned. She looked at her with some surprise and asked, "Didn't Oh Ming give you money?" Yu Lily was a little embarrassed. She shook her head and slightly looked down. "It doesn't matter. You try it on first. I will buy it for you." Su Qianxi looked at the clothes in Yu Lily's arms. "They are all so beautiful. It suits your temperament." "No, it's better, it doesn't matter. Try it on first." Su Qianxi gently pushed her to the fitting room. "Try it on and see if it looks good." Yu Lily hesitated and walked in. Finally, she took off her clothes and put on a black dress. She looked at the size. It was the smallest, but it directly fell on her body. It was too big. Yu Lily put it on and found that she had lost so much weight. She looked like a refugee. No wonder Su Qianxi looked at her with a strange expression. "Lily, show me when you are done," Su Qianxi shouted outside. She quickly opened the door and walked out. Su Qianxi saw it and had an exaggerated expression on her face. She said, "Beautiful." It was so fake. When Yu Lily saw his expression, she couldn't help but laugh. Looking at her baggy dress in the mirror and Su Qianxi's funny expression, Yu Lily pulled the hem of her dress and asked, "Really?" The waiter quickly came forward and said, "Yes, you look good in it, but your figure is a little slim. I'll get you an XS. Yes, yes. Bring it over and let Lily try it." The shop assistant quickly brought a smaller one over. Under Su Qianxi's encouraging gaze, Yu Lily went in and changed it. Just right. The fit was unexpected. This time, Su Qianxi no longer had an exaggerated expression. She was truly amazed and praised, "Beautiful." When Yu Lily saw her like this, she also laughed. Then she changed several sets of clothes in a row, keeping the good-looking ones and sifting out the ugly ones. In the same store, she bought 3 sets of clothes. Chapter 851. However, Su Qianxi did not even blink and swiped the card. After Yu Lily went out, she whispered, "Qianqian, I will return the money to you later. Don't mention it. When we were in school, you helped me a lot. It's just buying a few clothes. You don't have to be so polite with me." While talking, Su Qianxi had taken Yu Lily into a store that Yu Lily used to wear. It was very famous and expensive. As soon as Yu Lily went in, she was attracted by the red coat in the middle. So beautiful. However, as the main item of this store, the price must be very good. Su Qianxi immediately noticed that Yu Lily was looking at the coat and said to the salesperson, "That coat, the smallest one, try it on." "Okay, please wait a moment." The salesperson was not blind. The clothes that Su Qianxi was wearing looked simple, but each of them was very expensive. And that coat was a limited edition of a luxury brand, very expensive. Hearing this, she immediately took out the smallest one. Yu Lily had no money and no confidence. Seeing Su Qianxi waving her hand, she felt sad. When the salesperson brought the coat over, Su Qianxi turned around and pulled her to the mirror. She took off her coat and said, "Try it on." When Su Qianxi's voice fell, the salesperson had already put it on Yu Lily very sensibly. After putting it on, Yu Lily's whole aura was different. The red color, combined with Yu Lily's white skin that was different from ordinary people, looked extraordinarily beautiful. Although Yu Lily now looked pitifully thin, and the overall face looked a little thin and sick, because of this coat, she was full of the aura of a queen. "It's so beautiful," the salesperson said. "You are the first customer to wear this dress so well, as if it was tailor-made for you. It's so beautiful." While talking, the salesperson had turned around and brought a pair of red shoes on the side of the window. The heels were very high, a full 10 centimeters. However, this height was what Yu Lily used to wear most often. "You can try this pair of shoes. The combination must be very beautiful. You are so suitable for red." As the salesperson spoke, she squatted down to help Yu Lily take off her shoes and put them on for her. Su Qianxi looked enviously and said, "So beautiful." Su Qianxi actually liked red clothes, but she could not stand the aura. Most of her clothes were bought by Li Xicheng. They were either light yellow or light green, or white, pink, and blue. Although they looked good on her, they didn't have Yu Lily's strong aura. Su Qianxi felt sorry and waved her hand. "I'll take the shoes and coat." "Qianqian, okay." The shop assistant was overjoyed. A pair of shoes and a coat added up to hundreds of thousands. Yu Lily's heart was bleeding. He silently counted with his fingers how many years he would have to work to pay back the money. At the same time, he was also extremely satisfied with his current clothes, and his heart was jumping with joy. It had been a long time since she had worn good clothes. Lily could tell the difference just by feeling the texture. Chapter 852. After shopping, Su Qianxi did not buy any clothes, but she bought a lot of cosmetics, in duplicate. The two of them found a place to sit down in the mall and ordered. Lily sat in a chair, looking very tired. Su Qianxi poured her a glass of lemonade and said, "Lily, why did you abort the child? Did you tell Ming?" The topic returned to the original point, but Lily's mood was obviously much calmer. Hearing that, she smiled slightly and shook her head gently, saying, "In order to leave him, I lied to him that he killed the child." Su Qianxi heard that and stared incredulously. Lily saw this and laughed at herself. "It's incredible, isn't it? It's too cruel. Before we talk about this, I want to ask you one thing." "What?" "Ming, are you engaged?" Hearing this question, Su Qianxi frowned and said, "I don't know. I have heard of it before, but I have never seen it." "I don't think so. If there is, it should be introduced to my husband. If my husband knows, I will definitely know too, so." "I don't think so." "Really?" "From another perspective, even if there is, even his brother does not know of the existence of this fiancé. How little sense of existence does this fiancé have?" Su Qianxi shrugged and said with a smile. After Su Qianxi said so, Lily felt that it was somewhat reasonable. After a moment of silence, she said, "At that time, the doctor told me that the child was likely to be deformed and advised me not to keep it." "No, why?" "My relationship with Ming, you know. I have been afraid, so I have been taking contraceptives, but I still got pregnant. Such a child cannot be kept, so." "Then why didn't you tell Ming?" Su Qianxi looked at her incredulously. "Does Ming not want this child?" "I didn't tell him." Lily twitched her mouth and smiled gently. "If I told him, I wouldn't be able to leave, would I?" How could you be so pretentious, right?" Lily laughed at herself. "I also think I am pretentious, but I really want to live on my own. Qianqian, I envy you so much. Do you know that?" "Envy me?" She was dazed. "Well, I envy your good luck, envy that you have a husband who loves you, envy your talent, your ability, your conduct, your popularity, your character, your mentality. A lot, I envy them all." Lily looked at her with tears in her eyes and whispered, "If I were you, it would be great." Lily looked at her with tears in her eyes and whispered, "If only I were you." Su Qianxi listened to her words and looked at her strangely. "Lily, are you serious?" Oh my God." Su Qianxi felt that the world was going crazy. "Lily, do you know how much I envy you? I'm very timid, and I'm not eloquent and cowardly. When I was bullied in the past, it was always you and Ihan who helped me bully them. I remember it all." Lily thought she was comforting her, so she drank a glass of water and didn't speak. Chapter 853. Su Qianxi looked at her and was not joking at all. "You know what I was like in high school, right? In the past, you liked to dye your hair. If you dyed it red, I dyed it red. If you dyed it yellow, I dyed it yellow. There was one time when you dyed it green, and I also dyed it green. Do you still remember?" Lily thought of the past, chuckled, nodded, and said, "At that time, I just dyed it with a hair dye stick. When the school checked, I washed it all off. Who knew that you still had colorful hair? In the end, I was caught by the class supervisor and was ordered to dye it all back." Lily thought of the past, chuckled, nodded, and said, "At that time, I only used a hair dye stick." Speaking of the past, Lily laughed. "How can you be so stupid? How can a normal person dye their hair permanently and change their color every day?" Ha ha ha, Su Qianxi puffed up her cheeks and said with some annoyance, "You're still talking about it? You made me so miserable at that time. I really went to dye my hair. After I dyed it black, all my hair was ruined. It fell off in bunches and broke. It was so ugly. Ha ha ha, however, I really like you, and I envy you. Because many people like you, I learned from you. You were arrogant, but you were popular. I learned from you, but I was hated by many. I can't bear to look back on the past." At that time, some people secretly laughed at Su Qianxi behind her back, saying that she was imitating others. "You are so stupid." Yu Lily's smile became bigger and bigger, and her eyes curved. Su Qianxi also laughed. "You are so beautiful and so likable. Why do you envy me?" "I envy you very much, Lily. Not only me, but many people also like you and envy you, such as Lu Anan and Lin Wanting. They used to be against you, but every time they were defeated by you. Many people in the class applauded you, saying that you were doing justice for the world. I could not do such things. You Lily, why do you envy me?" Looking at Su Qianxi's expression, Yu Lily was a bit dazed. Was that so? It turned out that while she was envious of Qianqian was also envious of her. The gloomy mood in his heart immediately relaxed, and he was suddenly enlightened. Yu Lily looked at the beautiful woman in front of her, smiled sincerely, and said gratefully, "Thank you, Qianqian." Hearing this, Su Qianxi also looked at her and chuckled. "Let's eat." After dinner, Su Qianxi took Yu Lily back to the hotel. Su Qianxi and Li Xiqing booked a suite on the top floor. In this 5-star hotel, there were only 2 suites on the top floor, one on the south and one on the north. Su Qianxi and Yu Lily were carrying a lot of things, but Yu Lily was so tired that 2/3 of them were in Su Qianxi's hands. She swiped the card and went to the top floor. Su Qianxi took Yu Lily to the suite on the south side. Just when Yu Lily thought she would take the card, Su Qianxi directly rang the doorbell. After 2 rings, light footsteps could be heard from inside. Yu Lily had a bad feeling in her heart, so she took a step back. The door was opened, and O Ming's figure suddenly appeared. O Ming looked a little tired. His light blue collar was loose, and he stood tall by the door, looking indescribably lazy. However, such an image had a fatal attraction for women. His almond-shaped eyes moved and fell on Yu Lily. Chapter 854. Before Su Qianxi could say anything, O Ming said, "Where do you want second brother to sleep?" Yu Lily heard that and looked at O Ming. Then, she grabbed Su Qianxi's sleeve for help and said, "Qianqian." If she stayed in the same room with O Ming, she couldn't imagine what kind of humiliation O Ming would give her. She couldn't stand it. She really couldn't stand it. If it happened a few more times, Yu Lily was afraid that she couldn't help but die again. Instead of being unable to lift her head and stand up in front of him, it was really better to die. Seeing this, Su Qianxi was a little embarrassed and looked at O Ming. She saw O Ming's eyes slightly narrowed, and an unspeakable sense of danger filled the air. Su Qianxi was even more embarrassed. She pulled Yu Lily's hand and said, "Lily, you'd better stay in the same room with O Ming. I'm afraid that Li Xiqing will not agree." More importantly, she was afraid that O Ming would not agree. Moreover, if she wanted to make them reconcile, she could only let them stay in the same room. This was undoubtedly the fastest way to achieve the desired effect. Just like she and Li Xiqing, they quarreled at the head of the bed, but they made up at the end. Su Qianxi gently pulled her hand away, then gently pushed Yu Lily and said, "Go in." At the same time, O Ming had already taken her hand and said, "They are living together. What's the matter with you?" Yu Lily's heart stopped, and she immediately breathed quickly. She frowned and said angrily, "You know what I mean." O Ming glanced at her coldly. His thin red lips curled up into an indescribable evil. He asked, "Then what do you mean?" Yu Lily was even more annoyed and sneered, "Don't you know what I mean?" Seeing these 2 people quarreling again, Su Qianxi coughed and said, "O Ming, didn't you promise me?" "I know. Oh Ming interrupted her and pulled Yu Lily in. He quickly drove Su Qianxi away and said, Li Xiqing is waiting for you. Go quickly. Then I'll go first. You, have a good talk. Su Qianxi put down the things and handed them to Oh Ming. Here, Lily's things. Oh Ming only glanced at it before turning to look at Yu Lily with a faint smile. Being stared at by him, Yu Lily's face immediately became hot. It was as if he had seen through her. It was as if he had seen through her. She turned to look at Su Qianxi and shouted, Qianqian, Qianqian. How about you lend me a few hundred yuan? I will take a taxi back. I have rented a house in the capital. I will go back now. I just remembered that I still have a lot of things to solve at home. Su Qianxi's eyes were hot. Oh Ming slightly tightened his grip on her wrist. He sneered with some displeasure and said, the shabby house that you used to commit suicide? Yu Lily paused and turned to look at Oh Ming. She saw Oh Ming's pair of peach blossom eyes, with an unknown smile, looked at her and said, the landlord has already driven you out. The deposit and advance payment that you originally paid have all been returned to me. They have been taken by me. Yu Lily was annoyed and blurted out, what right do you have? Chapter 855. Su Qianxi was locked outside, and suddenly felt a little flustered. Did she do something wrong? It seemed that the relationship between Oh Ming and Yu Lily was not as simple as she had imagined. Oh Ming wouldn't hit someone, right? Su Qianxi felt a little distressed. She leaned against the door and listened, but heard nothing. After a long while, she stood up and carried her things to the suite in the north. She took out the room card, and with a beep, the door opened. Su Qianxi threw all the things she had bought on the sofa in the suite and sat on the side. Her legs were a little sore. Just then, Li Xiqing had just taken a shower. He opened the bathroom door and came out with only a bath towel on him. Seeing her coming back, he dried his hair and asked, where did you go? Shopping, buying clothes, eating. Su Qianxi sat on the sofa, a little sad, and said, honey, I'm thinking if I did something wrong. I let Lily stay in the same room with Oh Ming, but it seems that she really doesn't want to be with Oh Ming. Will Oh Ming hit her? What should I do? Li Xiqing heard that and couldn't help laughing. He came up and gently pinched her cheek, saying, how is that possible? Oh Ming has been educated as a Western gentleman since he was a child. He never hits women. Will he scold women? Su Qianxi looked at him, feeling a little nervous. Li Xiqing heard that and was silent for a moment. It was hard to say. Oh Ming's mouth was so dirty, but seeing his wife's worried look, he still said, no. Hearing that, Su Qianxi breathed a sigh of relief and nodded. That's good. Let Oh Ming reform her. But it seems that Oh Ming really doesn't like Lily anymore. Are you sure this will work? I don't know. Yu Lily is a woman with a big heart. She wants a lot of things. Li Xiqing threw the towel aside and said, Oh Ming actually likes her very much. Don't think too much. What big heart? Lily is a very easy person to be satisfied. Su Qianxi was a little unhappy. Li Xiqing heard that and smiled without saying anything. Seeing his expression, Su Qianxi felt a bit depressed. What's with that expression? If she was so easily satisfied, she wouldn't have left in the first place. This woman is far more complicated than you think. Of course not. I know her very well. You don't understand, Mrs. Li. She is not as innocent as you think. He pulled her up. I don't think she deserves Oh Ming. Hearing this, Su Qianxi was even more annoyed. She shook off his hand and said, it's obvious that Oh Ming doesn't deserve Lily. Lily is such a good girl, but Oh Ming doesn't know how to cherish her. Do you know how many people liked Lily back then? You don't even know Lily. How can you say that? Li Xiqing felt a little helpless and said, let's not dwell on this issue. Go take a shower. She glared at him, stomped her foot, and waved her hand. Don't go to my bed tonight. Li Siqing looked innocent and did not know whether to laugh or cry. Did I do something wrong? She had already turned around and walked directly into the bathroom, ignoring him. Yu Lily resisted and tried to take her hand back, but Oh Ming held it tightly. Chapter 856. He forcibly dragged Yu Lily into the room, then locked the door and pushed her in. Oh Ming, what do you want? Yu Lily was extremely angry. What's the matter with the house? Don't you understand? You almost committed suicide in that place. The landlord was very angry and drove you out. Oh Ming slowly reached out and unbuttoned his shirt. His movements were slow and elegant. Yu Lily was even more annoyed and said angrily, "It must be your trick, right? The landlord likes me very much. How could he drive me out?" Heh. Oh Ming glanced at her from the corner of his eye. There was contempt in his sneer. You're too naive, little you. You almost killed someone there. If word of this gets out, how are you going to rent out the house? Do you really think that everyone can like you forever? Do you really think that everyone can like you forever? That last sentence made Yu Lily's heart skip a beat. Looking at him, Yu Lily turned around and was about to open the door. Oh Ming looked at her and said in a lazy tone with a faint smile, "What do you want to do?" Yu Lily ignored him and trotted toward the door. Oh Ming said in a cold tone, "Your good friend asked me to talk to you. Do you want to let her down?" Yu Lily stopped opening the door and looked back at him. After a long time, she asked, "What do you want to talk about?" "I don't know." Oh Ming shrugged and walked over slowly. His leather shoes landed on the thick carpet without making a sound. "But, don't you have a lot of things to say to me?" he asked. As he spoke, his footsteps had come over, and the distance between them had been quietly shortened. "For example, what you just wanted to say to Su Qianxi, but when you saw me coming over, you took it back." The footsteps had reached the door, and the distance between them was only 2 steps. Oh Ming stopped, put his big hands in the straight and neat trousers pocket, and slanted his lips. The curve was not big, but it was evil and charming. Yu Lily's heart skipped a beat, and she looked at him incredulously. Really? Will he really believe that there is another reason? Will he really believe that? I didn't mean it. This result was far beyond Yu Lily's expectation. Yu Lily's eyes were wet, and she almost cried out. Excitement and elation instantly condensed in his chest and overflowed with words. Looking at him, Yu Lily was about to speak, but the next second, Oh Ming said, "I am very interested to know what kind of lie you almost made up today." The words on the tip of Yu Lily's tongue were crushed and swallowed back. Just like the 2 children back then, they died in the womb. The excitement and joy he felt just now had turned into a joke at this moment. Ha! Yu Lily looked away and didn't want to say anything more. She turned around and unlocked the door. Oh Ming's eyes darkened. He reached out and grabbed her arm. Then he turned her around and pressed her against the door. The wooden door immediately made a dull sound. Yu Lily stared at him, gasping for breath. Chapter 857. Yu Lily felt a burst of anger and sneered, "When it comes to lying, who can be better than you? Mr. Oh Ming, I can't compare to your ability to make lies." "Is that so?" Oh Ming pressed harder against her, and the smile on his face widened. "So, you can tell which of my words is true and which is false." However, even though he had a smile on his face, his eyes were ice cold. It seemed that the next moment, he could crush her on the spot. Yu Lily fearlessly looked at him, with a sneer on her lips, and slowly said, "Of course, don't underestimate the degree of my understanding of you." This time, even Oh Ming's eyes narrowed. He looked at her deeply, like a rippling lake, with layers of white moonlight, so deep, so thick. "Then let's do a test, how about it?" Oh Ming pressed against her, chuckling and touching the tip of her nose. Their breaths were intertwined, and it was impossible to distinguish each other. Yu Lily stared into his eyes, and the moment her sight fell into his deep eyes, it seemed that the whole soul of the person was attracted to him. She had no power to fight back. What? You Lily even stuttered. Oh Ming looked at her, just chuckling, but it was indescribably evil. You Lily, Oh Ming raised his other hand, pinched her chin, squinted his eyes, and said in a low voice, I still love you. I still love you. These words made You Lily's pupils shrink, and her heart beat uncontrollably. It was so fast as if a small motor was installed, and even her body was shaking with it. Oh Ming's hand was placed across her chest, and he could clearly sense the subtle changes in her. His eyes slightly narrowed, Oh Ming slightly leaned his face forward, and kissed her lips. You Lily's heart beat faster, and she couldn't believe it. Looking at the face in front of her that was getting bigger and bigger, she was stunned for a moment and didn't know what to do. Oh Ming closed his eyes and forced his way in. He skillfully pried open her pearly white teeth and quietly penetrated her. His movements were gentle, but You Lily's heart almost jumped out of her chest. She flew to the past, to the time when he still loved her. I still love you. Is that true? Unknowingly, a layer of water vapor had condensed in her eyes. When she blinked, the water droplets hidden in it suddenly fell down. His breathing became shorter and shorter. With a throbbing heart, she lowered her eyes to look at him. Oh Ming tasted the salty tears. He opened his eyes and looked into her confused eyes. Oh Ming. You Lily looked at him. The smile on Oh Ming's face widened, and he whispered in her ear, Didn't you say that you understand me? So, are my words true or false? In You Lily's heart, there was a voice screaming crazily, Really, really, really. However, rationality pulled her back to reality. How could that be? Didn't Oh Ming hate her so much? However, the pair of eyes in front of her were smiling and gentle, so real, the voice in her heart was about to come out, but it was like a fishbone stuck in her throat. If she said something wrong, would he say that she was overthinking, and then, she would be more humiliated? You Lily looked at him and whispered, Liar. Chapter 858. Oh Ming lowered his eyes and chuckled. With appreciation in his eyes, he said, Smart girl. You Lily's eyelashes fluttered. She looked up at him with a smile and asked in a low voice, Is it interesting? Oh Ming, you don't want to let me go. Isn't it because you want to retaliate against me? Why don't you let me die of anger? Oh Ming heard the words, gently lowered his forehead, and put it on her forehead. He said slowly, Why should I let you go so easily? His voice was gentle and pleasant. But it was with great sin. You Lily could clearly feel the resentment in it. So cruel, you know. Oh Ming's big hand gently moved down and whispered, Your body is very attractive. His big hand wrapped around her waist and pulled her into his arms. Then, he lifted her up. You Lily was shocked. She struggled out of habit, but soon stopped moving and closed her eyes in resignation. With a low exclamation, You Lily was already lying on the bed. Oh Ming habitually put his knee on her lower abdomen, but soon, he thought of the matter of that year. Because of this action, which had become a habit, the two children turned into a puddle of blood. Oh Ming's heart was slightly tingling, and he quickly moved his knee away and fell between her legs. A pair of beautiful peach blossom eyes looked at her and said with a faint smile, These things you bought are not cheap. Even if Su Qianxi gave them to you, you wouldn't accept them, would you? You Lily listened and stared at him. Her red lips were slightly raised with sarcasm. Look, how well he knows me. So what? To save you. Oh Ming's long fingers gently lifted her chin. It doesn't matter who you sell it to. Sell it to me in the future. Then he lowered his head and kissed her lips hard. The price I give is higher than anyone else. He had sacrificed his entire heart for this. Maybe it would be impossible to get it back in this life. Who would give a higher price than him? Ha ha. You Lily sneered and looked up at him. Oh Ming's eyes deepened, and he smiled evilly. He bent over and buried his face in her neck. Hot and passionate kisses fell on her body. Yu Lily's eyes trembled slightly. She felt the impulse of the man in front of her, and her heart was full of sadness. Gently closing her eyes, Yu Lily passively endured his roughness. The passionate kiss went deeper and deeper, teasing each other's senses. It had been a long time since he had touched her like this. For Oh Ming, it was undoubtedly a familiar stimulation. His body had already reacted. He panted and peeled off her clothes layer by layer. Unexpectedly, when he removed the last layer of her clothes, he suddenly realized that there was an even breathing sound coming from above his head. Oh Ming paused and looked up. Yu Lily's eyes were closed. From Oh Ming's angle, he could clearly see her long eyelashes. Yu Lily's breathing was steady, and her chest rose and fell. Just looking at it, it was a very fascinating picture. However, it made Oh Ming laugh angrily. This woman actually fell asleep. How big of a heart did she have? He pinched her chest twice as a punishment, but Yu Lily just waved her hand and frowned. Then, she tilted her head and continued to sleep. Chapter 859. After a low curse, Yu Lily still did not respond at all. Oh Ming was speechless. In the end, he turned and went into the bathroom. The bathroom door was gently closed, and Oh Ming also turned off the lights in the room. In a place where Oh Ming couldn't see, Yu Lily opened her eyes and looked at the darkness above her head. Tears quietly fell from the corner of her eyes. However, her heartbeat was fast, fast. That sentence was true. Just as he knew her, she knew him. After Oh Ming took a shower and dried his hair, it was very late. He tiptoed back to the bedroom and unconsciously climbed onto the bed. There wasn't much self-consciousness involved in all of this, and everything was done naturally and smoothly. But after going to bed, he suddenly woke up. Damn, why am I so careful? For some reason, Oh Ming was depressed. After lying down, he pulled out the quilt that was under Yu Lily's body. Yu Lily moaned and turned over. Her even breathing could be heard. Oh Ming held his forehead and covered her with the quilt. Then he lay down and closed his eyes. However, his mind was full of thoughts, and Oh Ming couldn't calm down at all. Turning around, he reached out and gently hooked the little woman who had fallen asleep. Oh Ming's heart finally calmed down a little. But what he didn't expect was that Yu Lily took the opportunity to lean in his direction. Oh Ming's body was stiff. At the same time as he was stunned, Yu Lily had leaned over and gently rubbed against him to adjust a comfortable position. Then, there was a steady breathing sound. This was the habitual movement she used to have. She was like a kitten with sharp teeth and claws, snuggling comfortably in a warm nest after falling asleep. Oh Ming's heart beat fast, his body was stiff, and he didn't move. This woman really surprised me all the time. But, am I special? Was this unconscious movement in her sleep something that only happened to him? Or, does she do this to every man? Thinking of this, Oh Ming's heart was more like being scratched by a cat, itching unbearably. Oh Ming was not sleepy at all. He held the woman in his arms, and his thoughts had completely flown away. The night was silent. When Yu Lily woke up, there was no one beside her. The seat beside him was empty and cold. Yu Lily sat up. She was only wearing a thin shirt. Looking at the position beside her, she was slightly stunned. She clearly remembered that Oh Ming slept here. Could it be that she remembered wrongly? Last night, he seemed to have hugged her. Just like before, he hugged her to sleep. Just like before, she leaned toward him. It was a comfortable habit. But where was he now? Oh Ming had a habit of lazing in bed. Usually, when there was nothing to do, he wouldn't get up very early. He looked at the time. It was 8 in the morning. The landlady's daughter, Xiao Shui, looked at the tall and straight figure standing in room 403. She couldn't move her eyes away at all. His eyes lit up as he watched Oh Ming walk around and pack his things. He approached him and asked, "Mr. Oh, is you really not going to stay here anymore? Did she say she wanted to move? What a pity. If he lived here, this man might come here often. Although he was already taken, it was still worth it to be able to see such a man every day. Ming nodded gently and said, "We're going back to Kingstown. We've troubled you during this time. Chapter 860. I see. Snowy was disappointed, but she quickly put on a smile and said, "Then I will ask my mother to settle the account for you." "There's no need for that." Ming picked up the notebook that had been on the table for a long time. There was a clear outline of a face on it. Ming's eyes darkened slightly. Looking at the lines, he said, "You should have signed a contract with you. The rest is the deposit, right? Since it was a breach of contract, you should keep all of it." While speaking, his eyes did not move away from the notebook. The strong and clear outline on the notebook, with only a few strokes, was very vivid. It was Ming. At the bottom, there were two small and cute babies, with big round eyes, lying in the swaddling clothes. Looking through it, there were a lot of random drawings in the notebook. Some were intentional, and some were scribbled. At the same time, there were also a lot of words. "Life is worse than death. I can't stand it anymore." The black ink had solidified. Ming looked at the words, and his eyebrows were full of complex feelings. So, after writing this, she committed suicide? Noticing Snowy's gaze, Ming closed the notebook and put it in a small box. He said, "I can clean it up myself." "Thank you." Snowy blushed, nodded, and said, "Okay, then when you need me, you can find me. I am next door." "Okay, thank you." Ming smiled politely, and soon Snowy went out. After Snowy left, Ming picked up his phone and called Su Qianxi. Su Qianxi had just finished washing and picked up the phone when she saw the phone ringing. "Hello? Sister-in-law, this is Ming." "I know, what's wrong?" "I'm outside right now. Go check on Lily and take her to eat breakfast." "Well, okay." Su Qianxi responded and had put on her shoes. After a pause, she suddenly thought of the conversation with Lily yesterday and called, Ming. "Yes. Do you know why she aborted the child?" Ming heard the words, was silent for a moment, and then said, "Because it was my child." Because it was his child, so she did not want to keep it. Simple, rude, and hurtful reason. Su Qianxi heard that and chuckled. Li Xiqing walked out of the bathroom and heard her laughter. He looked over curiously and asked, "Who are you talking to?" Ming, Su Qianxi said to Li Xiqing. Then she smiled at Ming and said, "Did Lily tell you that?" Ming felt that her smile was a little ambiguous, so he nodded and asked, "What did she say to you?" "Hey, when are you coming back? I think it's better for you to say some things to Lily face to face, but you can't reject Lily based on your own understanding. Lily looks strong on the surface, but she's very sensitive. It must be because you're not good enough to her, so she's hiding it from you. If you don't ask, she'll definitely tell you." Chapter 861. Su Qianxi had never seen how bad Ming's mouth could be. However, what Ming said yesterday was enough to make her angry. In addition to Li Xiqing's words, Su Qianxi had already silently labeled Ming as a bad mouth. Li Xiqing heard Su Qianxi's words and felt a little funny. Ming's mouth was not bad, it was mean. Su Qianxi quickly hung up the phone. Seeing that Li Xiqing was still in his nightgown, she said, "I will go see Lily first. You can come to the dining room later." "Okay." Li Xiqing rubbed her hair, bowed his head and said, "Kiss me." Su Qianxi looked disdainful, turned her head away and ignored him. She picked up her bag and left. In front of Lily's suite, Su Qianxi rang the doorbell. After a few seconds, Lily opened the door. Her short hair was half wet, and she was wearing a bathrobe. When Su Qianxi saw her, she smiled and said, Oh Ming asked me to take you to breakfast. Let's go. Yu Lily blinked and felt a little surprised. She asked, Oh Ming asked you to come? Yes, Su Qianxi said as she got in. She looked around and said, How did you sleep last night? Is the room good? Well. Yu Lily closed the door and said casually, It's okay. I booked the room. Su Qianxi said with a proud look and whispered, How about last night? Did you say anything to him? What can I say? Yu Lily chuckled and looked down. What are you thinking about? She didn't say anything to him, but Oh Ming did say something to her. Some words that made her feel very hurt. Su Qianxi smiled ambiguously, raised her eyebrows at her, and said, Didn't you? Yu Lily saw her expression and reached out to push her face. She laughed and said, Go away. I just got out of the hospital. What are you thinking about? Oh. Su Qianxi looked like she understood. I see. Yu Lily saw the regret on her face and was speechless. She rolled her eyes and said, Where did you learn that expression? You're so mean. Su Qianxi laughed and once again raised an eyebrow. You learned it from the children's uncle Luo Zhan. It's really cheap, isn't it? At the same time, Luo Zhan, who was far away in Kingstown, sneezed. The soybean milk and fried dough sticks in his mouth all sprayed out. On the other side, Luo Ran closed his eyes and gritted his teeth. The blue veins on his forehead bulged as he gnashed his teeth and roared, Bastard! Luo Zhan shivered and immediately jumped back. He waved his hand and shouted, I didn't mean it. Someone must be scolding me, it's impossible to guard against it. Luo Ran held the cup in front of him and was about to throw it over. Luo Zhan immediately covered his face with his hands, closed his eyes and shouted, Big brother, you're a handsome man and don't hold grudges against me. Humph. Luo Ran put down the cup and looked at the breakfast that had been ruined by Luo Zhan in front of him. He pushed it away and said angrily, Clean it up. I'm leaving. Where to? A date. After that, Luo Ran picked up a coat and opened the door to go out. Luo Zhan was disdainful. Seeing the mess, he couldn't bear to look at it and looked away. Louis Han was playing golf with a client today. They arrived at the resort club early in the morning. As soon as they got out of the car, they saw a high-profile Maserati parked at the entrance of the club. This car model looks familiar. Glancing at the license plate number, he suddenly felt more familiar. A man wearing a knight's leather coat came out of the Maserati. He looked like a real person. Then he walked to the passenger seat, and a hot beauty got out. Chapter 863. As if feeling Louis Han's gaze, Luo Zhan quickly turned his head and looked at him. Louis Han raised his eyebrows slightly and looked at the girl next to him teasingly. Luo Zhan smiled slightly, looking quite pretentious, but as if he didn't know Louis Han, he quickly turned his head to look at the girl next to him, took her hand, and entered the club together. Louis Han looked at him pretending to be stupid and inexplicably felt suffocated. He laughed angrily, but quickly threw the key to the doorman, turned around, and walked in. The client arrived quickly. Louis Han ate with the client first before going to the golf course. However, coincidentally, when he was playing golf, Louis Han saw Luo Zhan again. Luo Zhan was standing behind the beauty, his arms around the beauty's body, and his hands were holding the beauty's hands. He didn't seem to be impatient with anything before. His eyes were gentle, and he was patiently teaching her how to play. He looked very skilled. But, when did Luo Zhan start to play golf? Lu. The client called him a few times, and Louis Han suddenly came back to his senses. He smiled and turned back to play with the client again, but he was not as focused as before. His eyes looked in the direction of Luo Zhan from time to time, and he seemed a little absent-minded. About half an hour later, the client was called away by a phone call. After Louis Han sent the client away, he was originally ready to take the car and leave, but when the doorman asked for the car, he stopped and walked back in. Luo Zhan and the girl were still in the golf course, but the actions of the beauty seemed to be much more skilled than before. Undoubtedly, Luo Zhan was a good teacher. But, when did Luo Zhan learn it? Looking at the skills, he didn't look like a novice at all. Just when Luihan was about to go up and say hello, Luo Zhan suddenly hugged the girl, looking ambiguous and very close. It seemed that there was a chance. Tut. What happened to being a single dog? What happened to not flirting with girls? He didn't look like a novice at all. Luihan suddenly felt a feeling of being cheated, and inexplicably uncomfortable, suddenly filled his heart. Looking at it, Luihan finally didn't go up, but turned and walked out of the club again. Luo Zhan accompanied Ruola to watch a movie. The movie was chosen by Ruola. It was a romantic literary film that was very popular recently. But after watching for a while, Luo Zhan felt bored. Sitting in the seat drowsily, Ruola next to him quickly noticed, gently pushed him, and Luo Zhan immediately woke up. However, to Ruola's surprise, Luo Zhan's first sentence was, "I want to eat fish with pickled cabbage and chili today." But after saying it out loud, he suddenly realized that something was wrong with the surrounding atmosphere. Ruola blushed and nodded. Okay. On the big screen in the cinema, the couple was hugging each other and crying their hearts out. Low sobbing sounds could be heard from the surroundings. Yora, who was in front of him, also had tears in her eyes, and she looked very pitiful. However, Luo Zhan suddenly had a feeling of displeasure in his heart. Baffled, she was filled with shame and anger. Chapter 864. Luo Zhan stopped and stood in the same place. Ruo Zhan tried to pull him but failed. She turned back to look at Luo Zhan and asked, "What's wrong?" Luo Zhan shook his head gently and said, "No, I just suddenly remembered that there's something that hasn't been solved yet. Why don't you ask your best friend to have a meal together? Or, you can go back first. I need to go back to the company to take care of something." Ruola felt a little disappointed when he heard that. But seeing Luo Zhan's expression, she nodded and said, "Well, then don't work too late. Remember to sleep early at night." Okay. Ruola looked at him with some reluctance. With a light step, she came in front of Luo Zhan. Luo Zhan was a little surprised and looked at her in surprise. Ruola's hands gently leaned on his shoulders, and the soft touch made Luo Zhan feel a little strange and magical. Ruola blushed slightly, stood on her tiptoes, and kissed him gently on the lips. Luo Zhan was stunned in place, but Ruola didn't dare to look back and just walked away. Looking at Ruola's sprinting back, guilt and self-blame surged like a tide. Ruola was a good girl, but he didn't deserve her. He stood on the street in a daze. After a long while, he picked up his phone and called Luihan. Luihan was driving. He glanced at the car phone, saw the name displayed, and picked up the phone. "Hello? Luihan, are you free?" "What? Tell me if you're free first. Tell me what you want first. Let's eat together." Luo Zhan's voice sounded a little helpless. Hearing this, Luihan seemed to have guessed something. There was an 80% chance that he wanted to introduce his girlfriend to him. However, Luihan still pretended to know nothing and said, "Oh, okay, then let's have dinner together." "Where are we going?" Luo Zhan thought for a moment and said, "Let's go to your house. I want to eat your fish with pickled cabbage and chili." "Damn, you can't do this, Luo Zhan. You still want to exploit me?" Luihan laughed angrily. "Do you want to present me with borrowed flowers?" Luo Zhan was silent for a moment. "Is this how you offer Buddha with borrowed flowers?" That didn't seem to be the case. However, he had never been good at understanding idioms. This Luihan was much better than him. It shouldn't be wrong, right? Luo Zhan thought about it, pretended that he knew everything, and said, "Sort of. Will you do it or not?" "Alright, I'll congratulate you. I'll go buy some groceries first. Wait for me." After that, Louis Han hung up the phone. Luo Zhan was a little confused. Congratulate him for what? Luo Zhan's car had been driven away by Luo Ran, so he basically had to take a taxi today. It was a bit far from Louis Han's place, so it took 40 minutes to get there. Louis Han had already bought all the ingredients. Luo Zhan entered the password skillfully, and Louis Han was busy in the kitchen. Clean and tidy. Louis Han's home did not look like a woman's home at all. Luo Zhan lay directly on Louis Han's sofa and slightly narrowed his eyes. Unknowingly, he had fallen asleep. In the dream, Ruala tearfully accused him of being heartless and playing with her. At the same time, the scolding and disappointment of his parents and Luo Ran filled his ears. Chapter 865. Then, Louis Han reached out and pushed him, and Luo Zhan fell backward. His whole body jerked, and immediately, he opened his eyes. Louis Han was shocked by his sudden convulsion, and after seeing that he was fine, he breathed a sigh of relief. He patted Luo Zhan and said, "How can you fall asleep like this? How tired are you?" Luo Zhan took a breath and sat up from the sofa. Louis Han saw that he did not seem to be in a good state and said, "What, where is your girlfriend?" "Oh. I let her go back first." Louis Han was dumbfounded and said incredulously, "No way, I made so much delicious food. I just wanted to get to know your girlfriend. You actually let her go back? Why do I want to get to know her?" Luo Zhan sat up straight. "Maybe tomorrow she will not be my girlfriend. I don't think we are suitable. Mn, weren't you two fine in the morning? You even hugged each other and played basketball. I thought you were going to get a room or something." Then, he seemed to have thought of something and said, "Could it be that you dumped her because she refused to be with you?" "Scumbag." Luo Zhan said. "When did I go to play basketball? Did you see it wrong? Damn, I don't know you. How could I see it wrong? You must have seen it wrong. I didn't play basketball today." Luo Zhan stood up and went directly to the bathroom. After coming out, he shouted, "I'm starving. Let's eat." Louis Han thought of this morning, when Luo Zhan pretended not to know him, and he pouted. After washing his hands, they went to the table together and Luo Zhan ate happily. Louis Han ate slowly and said, "Seriously, you can't play like this. Girls have to be pursued slowly. Who can stand it if you ask to get a room all at once? By the way, this girl should not be the same as the nightclub girl you had last time, right?" Luo Zhan ate and listened with a confused face. "Don't pretend to be stupid. I saw it, twice. I don't know how many times I didn't see it." "Louis Han, you must have. He saw it wrong." However, just when he was about to say it, Luo Zhan suddenly remembered. "Luo Ran, where are you going?" "Date." Thinking of Luo Ran, Luo Zhan snorted, looked at Louis Han, and said, "I know, the person you saw was not me. How is that possible? I'll recognize you even if you turn into ashes. Do you really think I'm blind? Or do you have a twin brother?" Luo Zhan was silent for a moment, then let out a long hiss, and said with some embarrassment, "How should I say this? I didn't want to tell you, but since you asked, then I'll admit it. What? I do have a twin brother. He just came back from London some time ago." Luo Zhan snorted and said with a look of disbelief, "Then why have you never mentioned it before?" "Why should I mention it? It's not a big deal anyway." Luo Zhan didn't care at all. He took a sip of the pickled cabbage soup and said, "He has his parents, and I have mine. We don't have many opportunities to see each other all year round. Even O Ming and Lao Er rarely see him, let alone you." Chapter 866. Louis Han was worried that he would not be able to finish it. Unexpectedly, most of it went into Luo Zhan's mouth. He said he was here to eat, and he really came to eat. After Luo Zhan was full, he helped clean up the dishes and did not say a word. After cleaning up and washing the dishes, when Luo Zhan was ready to go back, his phone rang. It was Li Sicheng. Lao heir. Come to Palace 1. Okay, but I have eaten. If you want to eat, you don't have to wait for me. Luo Zhan was a little sleepy after eating and yawned. Suddenly, the voice on the other side suddenly changed, and it was O Ming's voice. He said, "You are familiar with Lu, right? Ask him to come with us." Why? Luo Zhan was a little puzzled. But soon, there was a flash of white light in his mind, and Luo Zhan immediately understood and asked, "Is it, the woman surnamed you back?" Yes. All the causes and consequences had been connected, and Luo Zhan immediately knew what it meant. Glancing at Luihan, who was sitting on the side playing with his mobile phone, he said, "Oh, you can rest assured that Luihan does not like that woman." Luihan heard his name, turned his head and looked over, a little confused. However, O Ming did not explain much and said, "Just come over." After that, he had hung up the phone. Luo Zhan was a little helpless, looked at Luihan, and said what O Ming said. "Well, anyway, I have nothing to do." Luihan stood up and said, "I'm going to change clothes." At 1:00 in the afternoon, in the capital. O Ming came back with a lot of things from Yu Lily, all of which seemed to be more meaningful. After returning to the hotel, Yu Lily just came back after eating with Su Qianxi. Seeing the pile of things that belonged to her, Yu Lily was a little surprised and felt very close. She took the phone, turned it on, and went to play with other things. O Ming watched her quietly hide the notebook before looking at other things. His eyes were slightly deep, and he took the lead to say, "Let's go back to Kingstown today." Yu Lily heard that, slightly stunned, thinking that she had heard it wrong. She looked up and asked O Ming, "What did you say?" "Go back to Kingstown and stay in the Shishan villa." O Ming sat on the sofa and slowly unbuttoned his cufflinks. "You seem to be good at drawing. Why don't I arrange a job with comics for you?" There was a comic website under O Group, which was mainly a charging channel for wireless clients. Yu Lily had already heard of the website's high potential. But to directly give him a position. Wasn't this the legendary backdoor entrant? Wait. How did he know that she was good at drawing? Yu Lily subconsciously looked at the notebook that she had secretly hidden. Here, after her diary disappeared, it replaced it and became a new diary. It had always been by her side. O Ming probably saw it. In addition to the text, there were also many illustrations. Many of them were human faces, and O Ming was undoubtedly the one with the highest appearance rate. And Luihan, second. O Ming squinted at her and said, "You still like that Luihan?" Yu Lily didn't know what he meant by that. She looked at him anxiously. "What are you afraid of?" "I won't eat him. I don't really like him. In the past, I especially liked this type of boy, but now I don't like him anymore." "Is that so?" O Ming's voice was low, and the meaning was unclear. Chapter 867. When O Ming heard those 3 words, it was as if he had heard something funny. A pair of peach blossom eyes looked at her, and his smile deepened. He gently took off his coat, and his voice seemed to be careless. He said slowly, "If I understand it correctly, the so-called jealousy should be an irrational behavior of a person who is unhappy, angry, uneasy, or even angry when his lover faces another person of the opposite sex." Jealousy was jealousy. After being translated in this way, Yu Lily suddenly felt that the words suddenly became lofty. He continued, "And you, do you think that you are my lover?" Yu Lily was stunned when she heard what O Ming had said. Obviously, he was not. Yu Lily originally wanted him to shut up, but she did not expect such a reply, and suddenly became embarrassed. She thought that he would be the passive one. However, O Ming's rank was obviously much higher than he had imagined. O Ming's eyes looked at her and smiled, slightly raised his eyebrows, and slightly raised the corner of his mouth. "You are just my lover." After a pause, he added, "There can be many lovers, but there can only be one lover. Yu Lily's heart was suffocated, and she felt a sharp pain. Lover, lover. It seemed that there was only a difference of one word, but the difference was like heaven and earth. In order to get, the person who paid money was a lover. In order to get, the person who paid sincerity was a lover. Yu Lily never expected, but facing it like this, she still couldn't help but feel pain. What a knife. Oh, hee hee. Yu Lily looked at Oh Ming with an indifferent expression and shrugged. I already knew it. It was just a joke. But, you're so serious. I'll think you're hiding it, Mr. O. Oh Ming's expression was obscure, and he said with a faint smile, it's best to say it clearly, so that you can stop thinking about something that doesn't belong to you. Yu Lily's face was even more terrible. Oh Ming acted as if he didn't see it, looked around, and said, go pack up, and go back to Kingstown in the afternoon. While speaking, Oh Ming had already stood up and entered the bathroom. Yu Lily looked at Oh Ming's back, and her lips were pressed into a line, and her face was slightly pale. Looking at the notebook in her hand, Yu Lily sat on the bed and flipped through it. She had bought this book back when she was in Kingstown. Because it looked very beautiful, Yu Lily bought it without much thought. Occasionally, he would scribble on it. It was a very thick book. It was a beautiful steel plate with a thick hard paper cover. It was hard to tell how much paper was inside. On the last page, a name card was drawn. Dr. Jean Baiha was the chief physician of obstetrics and gynecology at the First Hospital of Kingstown. At the bottom of the business card, Yu Lily had clearly written a few words, I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. Seeing these words, Yu Lily felt a lump in her throat, but then she closed the book and stuffed it into the box on the side. Oh Ming was in the bathroom, leaning against the glass cubicle with his phone in his hand. Looking at the business card taken on his mobile phone, Oh Ming thought for a long time before he opened WeChat and sent it to Su Cheng. Editor, Yu Lily. Su Cheng immediately understood and replied, okay, check it right away. You're tuning into the Romantic Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.